And on Monday, Disha y'all, we'll be doing an event here. It's September 12th. She is our Grisham writer-in-residence for this year. We're very excited to have her. She wrote Secret Life of Church Ladies. And this event will be at 5:30. It is a mask required event. We'll have some extras for anybody that leaves theirs at home, but just keep that in mind. And I hope to see y'all all there. I'll be taking names. And then on Thursday, Thacker Mountain Radio, again at the Powerhouse. This is sort of a special event. There's field guides called the Wild Sam Field Guides. And they're a little bit unusual. They don't have color pictures, and their whole idea is to really kind of get to the heart of a place. And so they're almost as much field guides for travelers and tourists as they are for people that live in a place. And they have done, they've done San Antonio and Brooklyn and Atlanta and Memphis, and now they've done Oxford, Mississippi. So this is their first town-size field guide. So we're very excited to be celebrating that. So it'll be a special Oxford-themed Thacker with the Wild Sam Field Guides. Bill Griffith and Rachel Hudson from the Roanoke House will be there, and Ralph Eubanks will be reading his special essay, and Joe Stinchcombe will be giving us a little cocktail lesson. So it's going to be a really fun night. I hope y'all can come to that too. And then David Wharton will have he has a new book of photography called Roadside South, September 20th. David is a professor at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, Documentary Studies, and then I have to keep going because we have so many Oxford things going on. Thacker Mountain Radio again, Derek Harrell. He has a book of poetry, Come Kingdom, on September 22nd. So we've just got so much Oxford stuff going on. It's so great. And tonight is no exception. We're very happy to have welcome this doll Apollo into the world, Melissa Ginsburg, who is our friend and professor of creative writing at the University of Mississippi. This is, she's written 2 novels, Sunset City and House Uptown, and another collection of poetry called Dear Weather Ghost, and I think a couple of chapbooks as well. Three chapbooks. The last one was Apollo, and was that a prequel to Doll Apollo?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you don't have to listen to me talk to Melissa. Deanna Kreisel has graciously agreed to be in conversation with Melissa tonight. Deanna is an associate professor of literature at the University of Mississippi as well. So, Oxford in the house. Welcome, y'all.
Thank y'all for being here. I am super excited to read from this book. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and then read some poems, and then Dee and I are going to talk. So, Doll Apollo is in 3 sections. The first section is called Doll, and it's a bunch of poems about paper dolls. The second section is called Apollo, and it's poems about the Apollo moon landing, conspiracy theories surrounding the moon landing, the god Apollo and the moon, among other things. And the third section is called Toil, and it's has poems that are like set in North Mississippi landscape, but also deals with a lot of fabric patterns and textures, and like hopefully weaves everything together. The first poem I'm going to read is like a frontispiece, and it's not in any of those sections, but it's sort of conceptually ties together the whole book. So this poem is called Daphne. The myth of Daphne and Apollo really informed a lot of my thinking about all of these poems. So Apollo was, wanted to have sex with Daphne, and she was not into it. She was running away from him and could not escape, and so in order to avoid being assaulted by him, she turned into a tree.
As you do.
Right, like, yeah, if you're in it, then you can, then yeah. Daphne. Halted mid-stride, unnymphed as mayflies, laureled and wreathed, newly rooting, yet even as a girl she had that mentholated breath, loved bay, loved riverbank, played house for hawks, had that crown in her, that stillness. When asked, does she miss the chase? At each petiole unrolls a glossy nib, a bit of shade, a blade to lean against the flesh. To leaf the grove is no arrest. So these paper doll poems deal a lot with like gender expectations, the performance of femininity, female desire, also paper and how paper is made and its texture and its qualities. So I'm going to read a few poems from this section. Paper girls. The women slosh the girls in vats, the women spin the fibers, the women dry and press the sheets, the women stack the women and gather them in reams. The women do this work to their past selves. They are happy to bleach, clean, pulp, and soak in a vat. Slurry stings the skin, an act of preparation. It separates the girls from the women. The women are hunters after a fashion. They hunt themselves and fashion the tools they are made of. This one is called Craft Day. Scissors cut through the snowflaked morning. Dolly sharpens her edges, trims herself, gives herself fringe, makes more like her, sisters, clones. She scissors their slick magazines, girl skins sleek as blades. She hones her scissors on sandpaper. She will marry that abrasion, make it scrape her. She'll feel it. She'll unfold garlands. This one is called She's an Animal in the Sack. Dolly sees herself in the pond's flat plain. She lines the bank with the cattails, bending to touch their own necks. Wind disrupts the surface, upsets her angles, dog-ears her corners, pleats and tucks, makes her a crane. Origami Dolly, animal in the sack, bucking against rough burlap. Burlesque of the pond's edge, weighted choreograph, string tied at the top. She soaks and sinks, sheds pulp and mud below a willow's continual fall, continual rise to the surface. Snakes swim under, lay their nest of eggs, heat-sensing pits in their faces. In the paper dollhouse, all the rooms collapse. The cutout girl looks out the punched-out window, thinks of perforation and the rectangle she came from, the self-shaped hole she filed away. And what is the self wearing her drawn-on undergarments, curling edges, in danger of tearing? The self is never naked. The self may be pressed between heavy books. In the heavy books, the old saying, if you try to make paper dolls do anything at all, their clothes fall off. They can't stand up. The tabs slip the slots. A house made of dolls is a delicate system, architecture of held breath. Say the window is a body like yourself that you look into and out of. All flat planes the self perceives as bodies like the self. The self can be leafed. Every book is a prison of sisters. Okay, this is the last paper doll poem I'll read. It's called Paper Dreams. Rag paper dreams, rag dreams, newsprint dreams of the wood chipper. Doll paper dreams tabs and slots, dreams the sheet from which she was punched, how close it felt to free, uniting all those tiny holes to outline her in air. Dream paper dreams, dreams, forest floor, how clean it was, the forest of chainsaws, how renewable. Okay, the faked Apollo moon landing. So, I always feel like it's important to say that I do believe that the moon landing happened. But I did a bunch of research about this conspiracy theory, and I found myself quite moved by the intensity with which people cited their evidence and the close attention that they paid to the film, and it reminded me so much of the way that I read poems, and I also was writing these poems around the 2016 presidential election campaign, and the idea of not trusting the government or the media suddenly had new resonance for me during that time. So I use a lot of the language and images from that conspiracy theory in a lot of these poems. The faked Apollo moon landing. A parabolic arc of dust behind the rover's wheels binds me to you, Earth. The way you make things heavy, blow air into a space already filled with air. The way you hide your stars in the sky, you flag-waving army, you scientists with your answers. At the edge of the crater, starless black, multiple light sources, multiple shadows. The doubts creep in, the sky behind me, creep outside the viewfinder. The doubts lap basalt waves. Bring your war out from its shadows. Show it the stars. Show it the moon. Apollo. Wolf god, sheep god, God trapped in a mine, God of fields and flowers, of pastures and herds, God of exoskeletons, hunter and flayer, feeder of snakes, healer God of arrows, of oracles you will never figure out, God of colonies and the crying rock, unshorn God, shining God of mice and islands, wolf of healing, God in the womb, already frightening, killer of cyclops, maker of lightning, God of moderation, monster of light, tender protector, hunter God, liar God, colonizing God, God of ships leaving, of sun in the sky, of tunnels and holes, of sowing a seed, slayer of Python, God of the deed, of the deal, farm God, lover God, God of my sister Artemis, goddess of that sleek lens through which I look, the moon, God of ships and a sun, supplier God, contract God, twin God and wave God, waving goodbye on the dock and the ship leaving God on a wave. God of the oracle stops, God of compromise and centuries, God of whispered riddles swallowed on an island, snake-eaten God, God of dried up waters, cratering depths, canyon, erosion, billowing out, tributary God cut off from its source, God of the dry bed, of the Cold War, together with Artemis, slayer of progeny, husband the silvered arrows, quiver in the outskirts of the sky. A bunch of these poems are persona poems from the point of view of the spaceship itself. So this is one of those. Apollo the vessel sheds his parts. My Saturn, my thrust, my fuel-spent shell twirls off Canaveral, abandoned fawn, turning circles in a barn, something neurological wrong, its eyes closed, the right half of its body stuck, praying to a three-cornered God, the left in wet hay, muling, some nerve damage, something pressing on the spine. Goodbye, what got me out. Rust in ocean space. Mollusk open. Let the eels glide through. This is another one of those Apollo spaceship persona poems. My body, like a diner, fills with astronauts. I'm glad y'all are laughing. I think this is so funny. In footsteps in jetsam and titanium white, I split apart. I miss my thrust and light, my kneeling peace, my scientists, litter, oceans, orbits, televisions. I will never leave this husbandry. I am myself, fallen in the ocean, sun-bleached, canaveraled, washed in atmospheric gaps. My windows vacant as the heads of astronauts. My eyes like beakers of clear liquid measured in a vacuum. On the empty sound stage, there may I launch and launch, may I blink and bend the lights. Okay, this one is called When Doubt Comes to Apollo. Doubt arrives assured in her stumbling. Doubt scatters at Apollo's feet. Doubt falls about the god in a cloud. To trust a thing such as a god, as much as the god trusts his own appetite. Doubt tries it, but hesitates. In space, the liquid doubt does not pour freely, but forms a floating orb and dances slow before the gods' faces. Doubt marries for love the altar of questions, busies herself with the arrangements. Doubt will not require a television to see the event. Doubt, stitched in the shoes, watches from the moment after the step. Doubt has been married so long to the altar, each star a tribute doubt hunted and placed on a plate. Okay, so I'm going to read some from the last section, Toil. This one is called Pastoral. I was unincorporated. I was without a body. I was lots, not lots yet, parcels. I was ground where the pipes will go. I was shrubs. I was brush and the space between shacks. I lacked governance. I was lean-tos. I was dens in the earth and roots of the weak sweet gum. I was pear and turtle sunning. I was lungs unbreathing. I was the sight on the horse's neck where bats came nightly to feed. I was the blood coagulating into morning. I was waiting for full dark again. I was waiting for the wound to reopen. I was led to a tree, a weak tree strung with nets. I was the bat hoping to be caught. I couldn't heal myself fast enough. Okay, just have a few more. This is called Weren't We Here Before, When It Was Warm. Weren't there tendrils, new shoots? Didn't someone shoot? It was deer season, the hay bale, deep in the woods above the creek, a target. Rifles sounding from the fields out back, a spotted fawn, small as a cat, shot by children practicing. Couldn't I have held it in my arms? Wasn't there a new bow tied in double knots that came undone? Wasn't there a double bourbon and pushing the button on the dishwasher hundreds of times? When it was warm, wasn't the creek a path? The hayfield inhaling gold breath. Vegetation blocked our sight lines. Didn't the tall, straight oak fall over the creek and become long and become a bridge, a dead bridge, and bring the earth up with it? Two more. This one's called Toil. The original title was Work, and I changed it to Toil because it's just one letter away from Toil, which is the name of this section. So it's like close enough. I liked that symmetry. Toil. One must first make an incision in the fabric in order to speak. Fabric from the workers in metal and stone. Later, a building or machine, something skillfully produced. Artisans hewing their hard materials. An incision is hardly a made thing, more an undoing of thousands of intermingled fibers, a severance. As the pressing of flowers is an undoing, but also a preservation. One must first choose the specimen free from rain or dew. One must split a thick blossom in order to flatten. This last one is called Sky. To accommodate migration, the sky rips a series of bird-shaped holes in its cloth. To accommodate the lawn, it rips its lower edge to fringe. The sky is a loose net, 1,000 mouths hinging at each wing beat. Its eyes like the gray inside a museum, the color of a docent's shadow on the wall. If the bird moves out of sync with the sky's eyes blinking, one may enter the open shard, the brand new room of bird-filtered light. Thank y'all.
Talk to you about these poems. I love this book so much, and I read it several times before, and then I read it again and again, trying to think of questions, and I just told Melissa earlier I have about 3 hours worth of questions for her, so I figured
so get comfortable
with that,
everyone.
right? Cool, we can order some drinks from up the street. So I'll try to keep it relatively short. I guess I want to start with, you talked a little bit about the way the 3 sections fit together and what your concept of them was initially. So you almost kind of stole my first question, which was to talk about Daphne, because when you see the book, obviously Melissa explained that the Daphne poem is not one of the 3 sections, it's kind of a frontispiece, right? So I wanted to just invite you to talk a little bit more about the way you see that poem as connecting all 3, and maybe, one thing I thought about is, of course, the image of laurel, and she turns into a laurel tree, and that's the plant of poetry. So there's that kind of wonderful, it's almost like a kind of a traditional beginning, right? An invocation, in a sense, to the god of poetry. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that and how, and other ways you see that poem connecting the 3 sections together.
So there's trees all over this book, and the paper dolls are made from trees, and I didn't read, there's poems that are like really explicitly about that and referencing that, the sort of like treeness, the origin of these girls, and like Apollo is in that myth, and is also just like this predatory and violent male god is in like every single one of these poems. This book is totally about violence and sexual violence, and the violence that is done to the earth, and so that's certainly informing all of these sections. The final section, Toil, is so landscapey, and I was thinking, is landscapey, right?
Landscape-ish.
Okay. I was thinking a lot about the perspective of Daphne as a tree, like post-nymph, and a lot of the things that I do when I sort of latch onto an idea or a concept or whatever, is I just try and find so many different ways to look at that thing, and each of these sections does that, and like thinking about how a tree feels about being a tree, it's a horrible story, it's a horrible myth, and it's not the only myth in which would-be female victims of sexual violence turn into something else. It happens all the time in Greek mythology, and it's a weird and disappointing, I would rather just have, you know, human women not be assaulted, right? So it's difficult to think about, and it's disturbing, but there's also something so just like it changes the perspective. If you're a tree, then maybe you don't care that much about human stuff anymore, and that is such a relief and refreshing, you know?
I was gonna say she gets to be a tree. Like at least she doesn't get her tongue cut out and all the other
I
right,
know.
all the other awful things that happen.
She's
right?
so lucky,
She's
right?
very lucky.
Yeah. And also she didn't get raped, which is
Right.
awesome.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it happens before, right? And she does get to be a tree. I love that the poem so much. I mean, I love the whole book, but I love the poem so much. Exactly for the ways that it just, every time I read it, I think of another way in which it connects the three. Like, it's just like so rich and so multi-layered, and she's a tree, and it's also making trees, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, the 3 sections, I guess, this is just a really, you know, obvious and sketchy and simple way of thinking of it, but I want to kind of present this as a way into another question. So if the first, the doll section is, as you say, about womanhood, femininity, sexual violence. The second section, Apollo, is about kind of phallic instrumentality, right? And then the landscape, it brings it all together because the land is, in a sense, a kind of victim of that instrumentality. I was wondering if you could say more about what flatness means for you in the doll section.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a lot. Like, I had paper dolls as a kid. They were not fun to play with. I did not enjoy them. I mean, I had those cheap 1980s, like, just booklets that you know, they're like corrugated or serrated or whatever. And yeah, so as toys for girls, they were not cool. They were not fun. As like instruments of education for how girls are meant to understand their roles, or like grow up to be women, it's very unsatisfying, right? Like, they're just flat and they can't do anything. I mean, they're literally flat, paper's flat, right? There's not enough room in that to be a human. And so I was thinking about that a lot, but then I also thought about paper. I mean, so I love paper, I love books, I work on paper, and I've done some paper making, and I love the materiality of paper, the texture of it. I love that it is made out of trees, that it's connected to the earth, as all of us are, and it's flat in one way, but it also is a 3-dimensional object. It's just really thin. And if you zoom in enough, there are layers there. There's texture there, and so it's an attempt to think about, like, how to salvage a real self from this very unsatisfying thing. Yeah, and also, like, I started out as a visual artist, and I was working in 2 dimensions, you know. So I've had this relationship with drawing and printmaking and with paper for a really long time. It's something I've thought about a lot. So yeah, I just felt like there's more here than the sort of obvious thing, like patriarchy's bad or whatever, you know. So so I got really interested in, like, examining those microscopic layers, those depths, because it is there.
I love the way, like, the dolls seem to be straining against their own flatness, right? I mean, they're bending and the tabs are coming loose, and there's a sense in which when you bend paper, it takes on a kind of dimensionality, but you can only bend it so far. I also just thought of this just a second. The flatness also kind of ties in with I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't the conspiracy theorists who think that the moon landing was faked also think the Earth is flat, or there's different people?
That is a different
Okay.
conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of overlap in the people who believe those things.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, if you're a flat earther,
Yeah.
you have to come up with some explanation for the moon landing. So I feel like these people could be working together.
Yeah, they have a lot in common. There's that Venn diagram is.
Yeah. So what about, okay, so the other thing I thought about, so there's like, obviously this kind of, the idea of violence and patriarchy runs throughout the paper doll poems, and the flatness is kind of a wonderful way of kind of bringing that together. What about sisterhood? Because that's another thing. The word sister appears in a lot of these poems, and it's also just the idea of like or we think about the paper dolls. This is what I was envisioning anyway. The ones where you cut out and their arms are joined in like a long string.
Yeah, like the garland of paper dolls.
Yeah.
So that is in a bunch of these poems. There's different kinds of paper dolls in the paper doll poems. So like if you're worried about getting bored, a variety.
Right.
So those paper doll garlands are so disturbing to me to think about because they're together. They all look the same. They also they don't have hands. Their hands are just and like not having hands freaks me out a lot. That's like a nightmare I have a lot. So just like the trappedness of that and like. What does it mean to be just like in the middle of that garland or like on the edge? And what does it mean to be like the template, that makes the shape of all of them? That is something that freaks me out a lot and that isn't.
I just thought it's so interesting because of course it seems like in theory sisterhood could be an antidote to patriarchal violence, but in these poems it's much more about a kind of sinister entrapment.
Yeah, so it's, we as women enforce the patriarchy too, and that first poem I read about that really has the process of paper making in it, the women are making the paper and making the girls do the same thing that they're doing, And so, the sisterhood is an antidote, but also part of the oppressor, and it's like, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything in this book that is like offering a
redemption.
Great solution. All these poems.
I feel like some of the poems in the Toil section because it's like you're getting away from that kind of if the first two sections feel really claustrophobic and oppressive in like these really brilliantly done ways.
Doesn't that make you want to read it?
Yes, totally. It's great. But there is a kind of feeling of almost relief or openness in the last section, I think.
Yeah, there's also I didn't read any of these today, but there's a bunch of poems that are basically just some myths that I made up that are very set in this landscape, and that was really fun to play with. What alternatives could there be? If we're just stuck with all these horrible stories that we inherit. So there's there's origin stories of plateaus and of other stuff. What I'm blanking on that. Of where trees come from.
Right.
Yeah. So that was really fun and sort of a way out of the trap that I'm describing.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I mean, it ties nicely back to Daphne and the whole the invocation of poetry at the beginning. It's really so. I don't want to wear you out, but I want to ask at least a couple more questions about the Apollo section, and then maybe a more general question about your writing process. Okay, I have this contention that the poem that you read about the first poem in the spaceship voice. I'm forgetting the title. Apollo the vessel sheds his parts, right? Mm-hmm. So when I read that the first time, I thought, it was literally that the piece of the spaceship fell on a fawn and killed it. That is how I read it. Then I read it again, and I was like, no, it's like the fawn is a metaphor. He's like,
Yeah, it's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor. This is why I get paid the big bucks. But I also kind of liked my misreading, right? I liked the idea that, you know, the poem actually, that if you read it that way, wrongly, initially, the middle three stanzas are kind of almost from the perspective of the fawn, right? Like the fawn is like pinned under this piece of machinery. And then it kind of comes back again in the poem toward the end that you read with the fawn being shot by the child, right? So I wonder if were you thinking about, like when you were thinking of the fawn as a metaphor, was that a kind of a deliberate echo? Because it does sort of make the Apollo section tied more closely to the idea of the kind of instrumental phallic violence on landscape in the last section.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say like a lot of the images in the doll section and the Apollo section just come out of the landscape. I mean, like this maybe will go to like your question of writing process. I just wander around on my land and write things down. You know, so yeah, and there are like many poems in the Apollo section in which the spaceship is like longing for Earth and doesn't know where he's going, and then like all of the moon stuff, like we are looking at the moon from Earth, you know, specifically like from my yard, you know, and yeah, so there's the echoes of those images are one of the major things that ties these sections together, and it also happened really organically in terms of my writing process, but also, yes, it is intentional. So
that's always the right answer.
And so, yeah, so this is part of like putting a book together. The original animal in Apollo the Vessel Sheds His Parts was a kitten, and I was worried that the kitten was too cute of a word to put in there. I mean, like you can have a debate for a long time about like if fawns are cuter than kittens, you know.
Fawn is pretty cute.
I know, they're just so cute. But yeah, I was putting the book together, and I had this other poem about a fawn, and I just was like easy to switch it out because sonically it worked,
right. And
it was also like small and adorable and vulnerable and very disturbing to see one hurt, you know. Yeah. So that edit happens later.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think either one would work, but for some reason now that I know it's fawn, I can't really imagine it as a kitten. It wouldn't, yeah. Well, for one thing, I wouldn't have been able to misread it that same way, because my fawn was in a barn. And the thing lands on the barn. I don't know what I was thinking, but, so about Apollo, so this is the chapbook of Apollo, which I read first because I ordered it and it came and I read it as a standalone thing. So I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the process of composition of this book in terms of order, like did you write Apollo and think this was a book and then you added other things to it, or did you always have this plan in mind, or what was the sort of process?
Yeah, so I did write, so this chapbook Apollo is more or less the Apollo section in the book. I added some stuff and I edited all of it, but it's mostly the same poems. I wrote the Apollo poems first, then I wrote the doll poems like sort of in a rush quickly after that, and I was writing poems in the Toil section while I was doing those other things, and they didn't, I didn't think of them as like a thing. They were just, you know, landscape poems, and then I mean, what I sort of wanted to do at first was write a whole book of poems about either one of those things, the paper dolls or the Apollo stuff. And I wrote a ton more poems after the project was really done in order to like try to make a book length thing. And I got bored. They weren't as interesting. You know, I couldn't sustain it over 50 pages. I could only sustain it over 25 pages. You know, and so then I started just looking at this body of work, and I mean, this always, like, I write so many poems. I write a ton of poems. I have like thousands of poems. They're not all good. A lot of them are just like saying the same thing over and over, you know, and then I just like make myself stop writing and look at it and shape it and see what's there and see if it hangs together in a way that makes sense, or if the poems are like speaking to each other in ways that surprise me, create new connections, you know, show me things in the poems that I wasn't seeing when I was first writing. And so then once I figure that out, I figure out like what the book is trying to do and what it's missing, and then I'll like write poems to fill in those gaps. So that's how this came together, and the Daphne thing was when I knew that it was a book. I was like, oh, it's all the same thing. I was doing all this, like, yeah, I didn't know that. I mean, when I write, I don't know anything about the content. Like, it's all sound. It's only sonic. It's only, like, an emotional response, and it's only, like, a musical experience for me. And I don't have any understanding of content at all until much later. And, yeah, so I just sort of like stumble along listening to lines in my head and like muttering, you know, and that's most of my process.
I love that. I mean, I think that comes through in the sense that the poems are really musical, and there are lots of internal rhymes and like funny rhymes. There's lots of hilarious rhymes, I think. Like moments when I was like chuckling because, you know, these two words are near each other and sounded like each other. I really appreciate that description too of like thinking about it as a book, right? That like it's not just, you know, a bunch of individual poems that came to you from the gods, and then, you know, you're actually thinking about it as a, you know, the craft of a book, which is really interesting. So one last question, if that's okay. This is a question I've always wanted to ask you, and I can't believe I've never really actually asked you this before. So you are a poet and a novelist. And so my question is, probably you've heard this actually a million times, because it's fascinating to think about this, right? How do you know what you're writing? I mean, you answered it a little bit, like you're thinking about sound, right? But, I mean, do you feel like you are in a zone? Like, I'm working on poetry right now, so I'm working on this book. So every idea that comes to me, I'm going to try to turn it into a poem. Or it's time to write a novel, so I'm, you know, only going to think about things novelistically. Or do you go back and forth, or is it like, does the idea itself organically tell you whether it's going to end up in a poem or a novel? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so if I'm, well, I always write poems. Even if I'm working on a novel, I'm still writing poems, because I can't help it, kind of, and because if I don't feel right. It's just like a self-care thing, kind of. But yeah, the novels are like, they're so different. It's almost like, you know, it's like, how can you tell if something is a poem or a sandwich? You know, like they're just, it's like, well, this one, you know, does not have any of these other qualities, you know? Yeah, so like,
Melissa's next book of poetry. Sandwich recipes.
Yeah, so like novels are really difficult for me to write. My brain does not understand logic or cause and effect situations, or like large structures. I have to like work so hard. Like, I'm not dumb, you know, I'm like a smart person, but that, I'm just like, oh, it's so hard. Like, I feel my brain just trying so hard, and
Plot is really hard.
And it is, it does not come naturally to me, and it is only like diligence and my loyalty to the characters that I have created, who feel like real people to me, that allows me to finish novels. I care about those people so much, which is weird because they are not real, you know. And I just feel like I owe it to them. I have to do it for them and do the best job that I can. And poetry is has nothing to do with any of that. But I do in the House of Town. I let myself be more myself, more my poet self in writing that book. And the last chapter of the House of Town is more or less a prose poem about the novel. And I was like, I loved writing that. I felt so just like I was in it, and it was really mine in a way that I didn't feel quite with my first novel. And I just was like, well, I hope it works, you know. So I think, it's like a novel is just like a machine, and a poem is more like song, you know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer a lot. So what's the timing situation? Do we want to do questions, or what's the...
Do we have time for audience questions?
Do a couple of questions.
A couple questions? Okay.
Does anyone have questions? Scott?
This is a really important question. Do flat earthers believe that the moon is also flat?
I did not do that particular research. I am not an authority on all conspiracy theories, and I only know quite a lot about this one. And another one I did a ton of research on, I still might write this book, but I don't know. There's a conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe that the government manufactures all of the weather, and that is
chemtrails thing, or is that different?
It's chemtrails are part of it,
Okay.
yeah. And that I love it. I love it.
That'd be awesome.
It's like all my favorite things, just wrapped in it, you know. So I kind of do know a little bit about that one, but nothing else. Great question, Scott.
One more question? Anybody?
Okay, well, yeah, Lynn.
Yeah. So, are you gonna write? Are you writing another novel, or are you writing poems all the time? So
Yeah.
you know you're doing that.
Mm-hmm. So I have what I think now are like 2 books of poems that are both unfinished, and I need to figure those out, and I'm very in them. And I have an idea in my head for a novel that will also be set in New Orleans. It is, novels are like, they're so hard, they take me so long, and so before I start one, I have to make really sure that I want to do it, and I'm waiting for this idea to go away or for me to quit caring about it. And so far, I haven't for like 3 years, so I think I'm probably gonna have to write that one. And I'm actually really excited about it, but I can't start working on it quite yet.
Well, we look forward to everything that you do.
Aw, thank you.
Thanks so much for doing this tonight.
So I'm happy to sign books, and also I brought a bunch of astronaut toys that are just up for grabs. I'm not taking them home, so please grab one when you come up to get